Oh, you're muted, Dr. Spaniolo. You are muted.
Good morning and welcome. I'm Jim Spaniolo, Chair of the Search Committee for the position of Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And it's my pleasure to introduce the first of our three finalists this morning, Dr. David Carreon Bradley, who comes to us today from California, where he is Faculty Diversity Officer at the California State University, Fullerton. Now we'll have a Q&A after our presentation today, and that will be moderated by Dana Jennings of our communications team, and this will be done through the chat feature of this program. So we need to conclude by 9:45, but without further ado, I want to ask you to please give a warm virtual UTA welcome to Dr. Bradley. David?
Hello, everyone. Can you all hear me? Fantastic. So thank you for the introduction, Jim. I appreciate it. As Jim said, my name is David Carreon Bradley, and I am a candidate for the Vice President position, and I am happy to be virtually here with you all today. I thank you all for taking the time out of your morning to join in the conversation today. So I've been asked to present on pursuing inclusive excellence and provide my vision for the inaugural Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And I think that it is important to bring your whole self to the work that you do. So I'd like to share a little bit with you about my journey that has brought me here today, and I think that will help inform the vision for the office that I'll share with you. So I grew up outside of Los Angeles in a bicultural home. My father is white and my mom is Mexican. And actually, my mom and her side of the family are originally from Texas. So I'm excited to connect with you all in that way. Neither of my parents went to college, but they insisted that I go to college, even though they weren't 100% sure what that meant. So I ended up going to Grinnell College in Iowa. It's a primarily a white institution. And so I learned a lot there about identity. I'm also a queer man and obviously a first-generation college student from a low socioeconomic class background. And so there was a lot that I learned regarding identity and diversity and inclusion work. I ended up majoring in physics and minoring in gender and women's studies. And then I went on to pursue my PhD in engineering, where I continued my diversity and inclusion work primarily related to my own identities, but starting to branch out a little bit. So for example, I worked closely with the Women in Acoustics committee as part of my professional organization. And then went on to Vassar College, where I was a professor in the physics department. And the first 7 years that I was at Vassar, I was the only faculty member of color in the sciences. And so a lot of diversity and inclusion work came to my office naturally, in the sense that students who were looking for connection and mentorship from somebody who had similar cultural experiences to themselves would often connect with me. Also, when the institution was looking for, quote, a diverse perspective, they would often ask me to serve on committees and initiatives. And although I had great success in my teaching and research, and I also had taken on some administrative responsibilities, it was really the diversity work that I found myself passionate about, where I felt like I was making a really impactful difference, particularly with students. And so I was eventually appointed the chief faculty administrator for diversity at Vassar. where I worked on several initiatives at the campus-wide level. I then moved over to Smith College, where I was the vice president for diversity and inclusion and equity, and worked on several campus initiatives there, including opening a new multicultural center for our students, a complete revision to our policies and procedures to make them more in line with diversity, inclusion, and equity goals, and also worked on faculty recruitment and retention to ensure that they were more inclusive and equitable. After Smith, moved back to California, where I am now at Cal State University. I serve as the faculty diversity officer and focus primarily on diversity and inclusion as it intersects with academic affairs. And at this point, I'm ready to move back into a senior level position. I'm really excited about the opportunity of bringing the student affairs component back into my portfolio. And the opportunity at UTA initially was quite intriguing to me, particularly because the position announcement talked about looking for a person who will be a catalyst, a capacity builder. There's obviously the opportunity to develop a new office and a strategic plan for diversity, inclusion, and equity. And I feel strongly that diversity and inclusion is such an imperative in higher education today, and particularly in the national context of things like the Black Lives Matter movement and health disparities that show themselves along various lines such as race and ethnicity. And so I'm excited about this opportunity, and I'll share with you today what I envision for the inaugural Office for Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity. So the position description defined the office as an administrative, intellectual, and community-oriented campus hub for DE&I, diversity, inclusion, and equity. And I used that definition as the foundation for my vision. I also believe that the work of the office must be rooted in the mission and values of the university. And so, as you are probably familiar, the mission of UTA is the advancement of knowledge and the pursuit of excellence. And I believe the pursuit of excellence includes inclusive excellence. In fact, one of the values of UTA is inclusiveness and diversity, specifically to foster an inclusive environment that supports a diverse community of faculty, staff, and students. And I want to pause there and make sure that we're all on the same page with regards to diversity, inclusion, and equity. So I want to share with you the definitions that I use for these key areas and how they influence what I see as the vision for the office. So I define diversity as the differences in the demographic characteristics of a group of people, but specifically broadly defined. So those characteristics include things that might be more obvious on the outside, so things like age, gender expression, race, ethnicity, ability, but they also include things that might be more subtle, or you actually don't know about a person until you get to know them a little bit more. Things like language spoken, first language, socioeconomic class status, veteran status, immigration status. I borrowed from something called the Avanade diversity tree, where it thinks about these characteristics in the metaphor of the tree, where you have some that are more readily apparent and some that are underneath the surface. But either way, it represents this broad spectrum of diversity that I think the new office will need to tend to all of these, keeping race and ethnicity and other marginalized and minoritized identity groups at the center and at the focus of the work. Moving on to inclusion, I define it as the creation of an environment that fosters acceptance, involvement, and celebration of a diverse group of people. The way I think about this in the day-to-day life of an institution is weaving diversity into the fabric of that institution. So everything that the institution does is thinking about diversity and the sense of belonging that folks feel on campus. And then finally, with equity, rather than starting off with a word definition, I'll use some images to communicate this idea that are often used by diversity practitioners in the field. So thinking of equity, we can actually start off by thinking sort of its opposite, which is inequality. So in this picture, you see there are three people who are trying to view a sports activity, and they are all experiencing something different. And in fact, only one of them has access to viewing the sporting game, and the other two folks are being blocked by a fence. And this would be an example of inequality where you have disparity in status, rights, and opportunities. And then we sort of shift to the next idea, which is equality. And equality is the state of being equal, especially in status and rights. And oftentimes at higher ed institutions, equality is thought about in the aspect of distribution of resources. So you can see that the resources that were distributed here are these boxes. And two of the people in the image are able to use the boxes to change their experience, so they can now see the sporting event. But one of the people in the image is not able to use the resource that's been allocated to them in a way that changes the outcome. And so that brings us to equity, which is the equal opportunity for access and success in the context of unbalanced conditions. And in this case, it's looking at a revised distribution of resources that takes into account that context in such a way that now one of the boxes gets moved over, the other box gets broken down and converted into a ramp so that everyone has the same outcome. And that's really what equity is about, is looking at that opportunity for access and success, recognizing the context of unbalanced conditions, and focused on equality of outcome. And so if we take these ideas of diversity, inclusion, and equity and put them within the context of a new office focused on these issues, I want to share with you what I see as key actions that the office would engage in. And I've combined them into these key areas that were given in the position announcement of administrative, intellectual, and community orientated. So under administrative, I think one of the most critical key actions is to strategize. So this will include developing a strategic plan for diversity, inclusion, and equity, looking at how to integrate DE&I into the fabric of the institution. That goes back to that definition of inclusion. Looking at accountability mechanisms, how to make sure that we're moving towards the goals that we set for DE&I across the institution and all of the various units. Reviewing the institutional policies and procedures and updating, revising, and removing policies as necessary to ensure that they're as inclusive and equitable as possible. There's obviously budget and staffing concerns when it comes to administrative work, and that includes both looking for opportunities for growth, but also trying to figure out where there may be opportunities for more efficiency. Perhaps maybe there are programs that could be sunsetted in an effort to develop new programs that are more effective and impactful. And then related to budget would be fundraising, collaborating, for example, with university advancement to look for external funding opportunities. All of this would be part of the comprehensive strategizing that the office would engage in. The next key actions would include benchmarking and assessment. This is critical for diversity and inclusion work to understand the forward momentum that is being achieved in this area. And that work, that benchmarking and assessment, must be data informed and evidence-based. And it can include things like campus climate surveys, looking at disaggregated demographics and making that information publicly available as part of the accountability mechanisms, looking, of course, at affirmative action plans and goals, evaluating the various DE&I programs that are on campus, both the ones that are coming out of the new office, but also the programs, events, and initiatives that are happening across the campus. looking at the impact and effectiveness of campus protocols, such as the protocols for hate bias incidents. All of this is part of the assessment and evaluation process that the new office would help to oversee. Under the intellectual category, I've indicated key actions of educating and sharing knowledge. So this will include things like workshops, trainings, professional and leadership development opportunities, as well as high impact practices and standards in the field. So I'm really lucky to work in diversity and inclusion in the current age, because there is such a rich amount of knowledge from other practitioners in the field, literature, research. There's an organization called the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Ed, of which I'm a member, and being able to connect with that organization would help to inform the intellectual work of the office were I to fill the vice president position. And the intellectual work would also include basically communication, informing, reporting, and receiving information. So this would include internal and external communication strategies, obviously a variety of electronic mechanisms for communicating, the website, social media, perhaps a monthly newsletter. The office could work to help coordinate the DE&I events that are happening across campus with a campus-wide calendar. There would be annual and periodic reporting so that folks are aware of what's happening on campus in DE&I, and also another mechanism for accountability. The office could help to facilitate discussions and listening sessions with a particular emphasis on centering marginalized voices, particularly those from the BIPOC community, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And then under the, the third bucket is community orientated. Two of the key actions I see there are support and empowerment. Basically, the office should be designed to support all constituencies on campus, and I've listed those here: students, faculty, staff, administrators, alumni, and local and global community members. Students, though, I think should be one of the main areas of focus for support, and that will entail close partnership with student affairs, for example. At the same time, it's important that the office is supporting everyone who lives, works, and learns at the institution, and not letting the focus on students sort of leave the other constituencies out. And so making sure that there's close connectivity with offices like the Provost Office and Human Resources and so on. In fact, partnership and collaboration are two more key action items for community-oriented work of the office. I've listed some of the major units on campus where I would see the ripe potential for partnership and collaboration. I'm happy to go into some of the details on what some of these partnerships could look like, maybe during the question and answer period that we'll have in just a moment. Beyond these major units, it's also important to recognize that there are places on campus who are already dedicated to diversity, inclusion, and equity work. And so I see the office as coordinating with those areas on campus and looking for possibilities for synergy. So for example, the centers that are housed within the colleges and the schools, there's a possibility for synergy with regards to the research and the activism that's coming out of those centers. There's obviously the Office of Multicultural Affairs will be a key place on campus for coordinating the support of students, particularly those from underrepresented groups. So really leveraging the wisdom, the experience, the expertise, and the work that's already happening in diversity, inclusion, and equity will be a key action area for the new office. Finally, the last action item that I imagine for the office is to listen. And it's interesting because my academic career, I started off in physics and engineering, and my main area of focus was acoustics. I studied how sound energy behaves in performing arts spaces. That's what I did my dissertation on, and 10 years of research at Vassar College. And part of what I looked at was how human beings hear sound in these various performing arts spaces. But even though I was so steeped in that work, I don't think I really understood what it meant to listen until I fully engaged in diversity work, because listening is such a critical component to the work in this area. It's so important to understand people's lived experiences, their stories, their histories, and how that those stories and histories can influence the diversity and inclusion work that is happening now. And in fact, that listening should be focused on a sense of understanding, so that then finally we can act and actually do something. So it's important to identify areas of priority and areas of focus, understand institutional requirements and context, and then set specific short and long-term goals so that we can act. Determine who will be held accountable for those goals, and then garner the resources necessary to have success in reaching those goals. And so all of that coalesces together into those action items that I mentioned before, that I could envision the new office undertaking in an effort to realize diversity and inclusion and equity on campus, and bringing UTA to that next level of excellence in these areas. So with that, I'll open it up to all of you so that I can listen and learn from you all. And I'm excited to hear what you all have to say. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Hi, David. This is Dana Jennings with the Communications Department here at UTA. First, I want to say thank you so much for a thoughtful presentation and for joining the Maverick community here in this virtual format. We've got some great questions that have been populated in the chat. So with that being said, we will just kick right off. Our first question, other than ADA compliance, how do you see conversations on disability fitting into diversity, equity, and inclusion work? And how would you make sure these are part of priority decision making and discussions?
Thank you for the question. So I think that compliance is, for not just disability services, for D&I in general, compliance is the first step. It's sort of the bare minimum. And we really have to push past that to think more critically about how we take compliance and turn it into a sense of inclusion and equity. Specifically to disability services, we have to think through the lived experience of folks who have disabilities on campus, and what their challenges and opportunities might be, and how we can serve them better. So that could be something in the classroom, like the design of the chairs and the desks, for example. It could be with regards to our electronic media. Are we making sure that we're being as accessible as possible? And it's one of the reasons why I believe that diversity, inclusion, and equity must span all of the boundaries of the institution, because it's not just multicultural affairs. It's really about the way that the institution operates, the fabric of the institution, and how that relates to people's lived experiences, and folks with disabilities can sometimes get left out of that conversation. And so one of the things that I would do is connect with members of the campus who identify as having a disability or being differently abled, and learning from them what some of the areas of change that they're looking for. And then I would leverage my position as a vice president to incorporate those concerns into the direction that the institution takes.
Thank you so much. So our next submission, this individual feels that access, diversity, and retention of faculty and staff are challenges at UTA. what strategies would you employ in partnership with our new Chief Human Resource Officer to reduce bias in employment selection and in performance evaluations?
Yes, so the office that I work in at Cal State Fullerton, Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity Programs, is actually housed within Human Resources. So the time that I've spent here, I've been able to learn a lot about the functions of HR and the opportunities and some of the challenges associated with that work. And a large majority of my recruitment and retention work has been on the faculty side. But over the last couple of years, I've been able to take the lessons that I've learned in that arena and apply them to the staff side. And there are a lot of high impact practices that can be employed, and figuring out what would be appropriate at UTA, I think, would be the next step. But those high impact practices include things like search committee trainings, anti-bias training for search committee members, hiring managers, also looking at position announcements to ensure that there's inclusive language in there to start the process off from the very beginning with regards to staff. Onboarding is another critical area where you can infuse inclusive and equitable practices to help improve the climate for staff. I think that there's a lot of information out there, and it's just a matter of seeing what will work best in the particular context of UTA, learning from folks what has been a challenge for them in the past and where there are areas for growth.
Thank you. So our next question comes from Leah. She'd like to know how you will approach increasing inclusivity and belonging, as you mentioned, for queer identities at UTA, especially in a state like Texas versus your current state of California.
Yeah, so obviously I'm a member of the LGBTQ community, and I've lived in a variety of places, including places like Nebraska, where it has been particularly challenging being a member of that community. I think one of the key ways of increasing inclusion and belonging for that group is to be a role model, to be out myself, and to encourage other folks on campus to be out, particularly folks in leadership positions on the faculty, things like that. There are ways that allies on campus could signal their support for the LGBTQ community. So I actually had a meeting with the deans just before this, and one of the deans had an HRC sticker that was visible behind them in the Zoom screen. And I think that is one of the ways of increasing inclusiveness is by sort of looking for those opportunities to signal support. And then I would imagine that the vice president and the new office would partner with the existing initiatives already happening on campus. So I know that the Office of Multicultural Affairs has an LGBTQ+ program. I know that the Women's and Gender Studies program has a strong emphasis on queer folks. And so partnering with those units on campus and figuring out what is already happening and how can we leverage that work to increase the visibility of queer folks, but also the support for them as well.
So our next question is a little bit more plainly put and a bit more simple. Do you think it's actually feasible to achieve equity?
I think that as a diversity practitioner, it's imperative that I remain optimistic. I think that in a lot of ways, diversity and inclusion and equity are moving goals, in the sense that your work is never done. You're never going to come to work one day and say, okay, we achieved diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we're finished. I think it's ever evolving. So in that regard, I don't think that equity is an end goal, but I definitely think that we can move towards increased equity, and we've seen that in a variety of areas, both in higher education and in the nation, and in other ways we've exposed inequity to a broader group of people, particularly recently in areas such as Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd protests. And so what that means is that now more people realize that there's more work to be done. So I think that it's definitely possible to achieve equity, but I think equity is ever evolving, and that's why having a centralized office and having a senior level position who's dedicated to this work, I think is so imperative, because it can help to ensure that the institution is continuously moving towards that goal.
Thank you. So our next question is a bit more about you as a person. What makes UTA the best place for you to continue your career in higher education?
Sure. So I really like that UTA is an Hispanic serving institution in a diverse and multicultural urban environment. What I've learned about UTA so far, and most of that has been from the websites, but also from some of my conversations with the search committee, is that UTA has a long history of diversity, particularly in the student body, and you all have had a recent recommitment to inclusion and equity, particularly with Dr. Lim's inclusion initiatives. I also think that UTA is on the precipice. The fact that you're forming this office, that you're developing this vice presidential role, it suggests to me that the institution is ready for the next step. And that's what's really exciting to me. I want to be able to come in and help in that regard and to make a difference. I don't want to be a chief diversity officer that's sort of there as a figurehead. I want to be there as somebody who is making an impact and helping the organization move forward. And from what I can tell, UTA is that type of institution, and that's where you all are on your journey in these areas, and that's why I'm particularly interested in this opportunity.
David, can you give an example of significant change that you helped facilitate in your current or past position to address issues of DEI to kind of help demonstrate your approach and your impact?
Yeah, so one of the first institutional initiatives that I worked on was at Vassar. And the focus there was on changing the mission statement of the institution to more clearly articulate our commitment to diversity and inclusion. I don't know if anyone on the call has been involved in revising or crafting a mission statement, but it's a Herculean task because the mission statement is so foundational to an institution. It really says what the institution is and who the institution is. And the mission statement at Vassar, we talked about diversity and inclusion a lot, but it actually didn't show up in our mission statement. And I felt, and the folks that I worked with on the initiative felt that we weren't being as effective in our diversity and inclusion work because we weren't able to leverage the mission of the institution. And so I engaged in that change, and I led a task force that was representative of all the constituencies on campus. So we had students, staff, faculty, administrators, and trustee members. We came together. We did research on other institutions' mission statements, other institutions' diversity statements, and crafted new language that we then shared widely through a series of town halls with each of the constituencies. We even made sure that we were being as accessible as possible. So we realized that certain folks who worked in areas like facilities management weren't able to come to the town halls and weren't necessarily on the computer all day, and so wouldn't be able to reply to like a survey. So we created a phone number hotline that folks could call in. We had drop comment boxes set up in various staff lounges across campus. So we really tried to get as many voices involved in the process as possible. Ultimately, there was a lot of conversation, particularly between the Student Government Association and the board, trying to figure out what the language should look like and really how far we needed to go in articulating our commitment. And it required me specifically to do a lot of ambassador work, bridging the students with the Board of Trustees. There had been some tensions between those two groups in the past, and so one of my key roles was bringing those groups together to find common ground. And ultimately, we were able to draft a new version of the statement that was passed by the Student Government Association, the Faculty Senate, and then eventually adopted by the board. And immediately we could see the effect. The president was referring to the new mission statement. It was being used as impetus for changing some of the policies and procedures in offices across the campus. And so I think it laid a nice foundation for additional change work that we did on the campus after that.
Our next question comes from Renee Hernandez with the student government here at UTA. They'd like to know what day-to-day operations should we expect at UTA with you in this position and leading this office from the perspective of the communities and programs that you mentioned working with?
So day-to-day operations, I think in the beginning, it will involve a lot of listening in the sense that I'll be meeting with many people across campus to hear what their concerns are and the work that they have been engaged in the past and in the recent past. Once I've had a chance to hear that information, then the office will work with the president and other senior leaders and faculty and staff and student leaders as well to establish priorities. And so I will need to know where are the key areas that folks need support in right away. So there's probably some key areas of training and workshops that people feel like there's a need for development, for example. I don't know what those are yet because I haven't engaged in the listening process, but I have the experience in diversity and inclusion on a broad array of topics, and so I would bring that to the table. I would also collaborate with folks on campus who have expertise in various areas, and particularly areas that I may not be as fluent in, and we would flesh out that educational component. There's going to be a lot of connectivity with regards to procedures and policies on campus. As I mentioned before, I think that the strategy work of the office will entail those components as well. And then after that sort of initial listening period, I think that my role will be in continuing to connect with folks on campus to see where the work of the office is making a difference and places where it's less effective and sort of iterating and adapting as we go along. So a lot of meetings, events, programs, workshops, and then sort of adjusting as we go along.
All right, it looks like this will be the last question that we have time for. Julian Rodriguez points out that almost 40% of the population of Texas is of Hispanic descent, but only 6% of faculty at UTA is Hispanic. What strategies should we follow to increase Hispanic faculty recruitment and representation at UT Arlington?
So there are a ton of possibilities. As I mentioned before, faculty recruitment and retention is one of my key areas. I'm a little hesitant to say which one of those are appropriate for UTA right now, because I need to learn more about what you've all have done in the past and what you're working on currently. I will say one area that I think would be helpful is in advertising the fact that UTA is an Hispanic serving institution. In looking at the website, as a person who was applying for a job there and sort of thinking about the perspective of a potential faculty candidate, there isn't as much information about the opportunities that go along with being an Hispanic serving institution and what that could mean for a faculty member. And so that would be one area that I would look into straight away in sort of advertising that and thinking through how we can attract more faculty who are not just Hispanic and Latinx identifying themselves, but faculty who are interested in and dedicated to supporting the success of Hispanic and Latinx students. So that would be one key area. But there are other things that could be done, looking at the position announcements, ensuring there's inclusive language in there, highlighting the opportunities to work with a diverse group of students, including the large Hispanic and Latinx population. So I would work closely with the Provost's office and the faculty to share with them the variety of high impact practices that are available for recruitment, and then develop those further specifically in the context of UTA.
Thank you so much again, David, and thank you to everyone who has put such thoughtful questions in our chat. There were a number of great questions that we just don't have the time to get to. So that being said, David, with about 3 minutes remaining, we'd love to turn it back over to you for any final comments.
Sure, thank you, Dana, and thank you to everyone who submitted a question. I'll keep my closing remarks brief. I just want to say I appreciate you all engaging in this process. The fact that you've shown up for this event shows that you care about and support diversity, equity, and inclusion. And were I to fill the position, it's folks like you that would be my primary collaborators and partners on campus. And so I really appreciate you all and the time that you took today. And I thank you for this opportunity.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you everyone for attending this very good, positive, interactive session. We appreciate your time, and you've given us a lot to think about, David. So I know you're going to have a busy day here virtually with the UTA community, and we'll look forward to the rest of the day. So thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you, Jim. Take care, everyone.